Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. We're filming this in the early part of May. We've just had some of our coronavirus restrictions on groups and friends and things coming to join us lifted slightly, which is really nice. Hope you're all really well, hope you're staying sane at home, and hope you look forward to our chat today with Ian van der Walt. Ian's a commercial photographer based in Melbourne here. He's a long-time Phase 1 user, and he also does a lot of landscape and architecture photography outside the studio for his personal work, and that's what we'll focus on today. Ian uses both the XF camera and has been using for the last week or two the XT camera, and he's going to share some of his insights and observations about using that, and we'll look at some images. So Ian, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
I guess I wanted to start off a bit so people can learn a little bit about your history. How long have you been shooting, and how did you start, and how did you end up using Phase 1?
Okay, I've essentially been shooting since high school. So I opened my studio, Altered Images, in 1986 with one RB67 and a Toyo View 5.4 camera. Actually, no, a Cambo 5.4 camera was the first one. And I've been working in the field ever since. I'd call myself a generalist commercial photographer, so I do everything from farm machinery through to food, a little bit of fashion, a little bit of product, whatever I can get through the door, really. Yeah,
great, okay. And so you're using the XF camera with the IQ4 150 for a fair bit of your studio-based work?
Yes.
And then you've got a Cambo setup, don't you, with Rodenstock lenses, and you put the IQ4 on that when you're heading out to do some of the shots we'll look at today?
I use both systems for my professional work, and what I'll do is I'll determine which system is best for the job. So if I'm shooting food or something, for argument's sake, I really like the interface being tethered, being able to control the camera from the computer, have my clients view the images immediately on screen, and that XF system works really well in that type of scenario.
Yeah, it's made for that, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Also with fashion or something like that, where people are working around, you can't beat that autofocus. It snaps in. I can use that all the time. Very, very good user experience for that sort of work. Mm-hmm. The Cambo that I use, which is a technical camera not dissimilar to the XT, I use because I also run digital SLR gear, and I was using a lot of tilt shift lenses, and I found that there is a tilt shift lens for the XF, but only one, and I would like more of a variety. So I went to the Cambo system to introduce more the shift, I suppose, than anything else, because getting out into the field, angled lines that should be straight and so forth were really annoying me, and I felt that was the next step, was to go to something where I could control that. But also, it's actually a lighter system, so if I travel, it's much easier for me to throw into my baggage to take that away, because it's a smaller camera.
And I suppose with the XT, now that you've played with that, it's even smaller again, form factor wise, so that's another benefit of the XT, isn't it?
The other thing I didn't say is also the lens quality. Those Rodenstock lenses, I don't think there's anything sharper on the market.
They're beautiful, aren't they? Yeah. Perfectionism. I've hung around you for a long time now. We've travelled a bit. I've been to your studio lots of times, and I've watched your work. And one thing I've always observed is how neat and tidy you are, whether that's your studio, whether that's the way you dress and your hair, or whether that's your imagery, which is always very well considered and very neat. Did you have to work on that very hard?
It's actually a bit of an Achilles heel, really. If you ask my mother, she'd disagree with that, because I was the messiest child. If they went away on holidays, they'd come back and I'd have to spend the day tidying everything up. But I think 35 years or 33 years of commercial photography, where you have to make sure everything's perfect, every skerrick of dust is off the product, and pre-digital days, you had to get it right in camera. We still work by that theory, but even more so back in the days of film. So I think in time, it's a trait that I've developed rather than something that I had. It's actually to the point now where it gets quite annoying, because now little things that shouldn't annoy me really start to bug me when they're not put back in place properly, or not done the way
I've seen that when I've been at your studio, for sure.
Yeah, and look, I recognise that that's a problem, and if you ask the guy that shares the studio with me, I have become very anal. And look, you can't go past my Dutch heritage either. I think that's a bit of a trait with the Dutch people. So,
well, it's always been a question I wanted to ask you, so I'm glad I got that out. One of the things with the IQ4 that Phase 1 really touted when they brought it out is this IQ4 Infinity platform. It wasn't that long ago that computers like this here were not as powerful really as the IQ4's Infinity platform is. And as we lead into looking at some images, I wanted to ask you, the IQ4, has that changed the way you shoot a lot? And if it has, in what sort of ways?
Oh, absolutely. So if I can go back a couple of steps, I first got into the Phase 1 system because digitally it was the only system that was going to give me the ability to do long exposure. Even though I bought it for work, I found that my personal work was generally being shot after hours when light was low or it was getting dark, and I stumbled upon this long exposure type genre, if you like, and it's something that I really enjoy. So if I look at the progression over the 5 Phase 1 backs that I've had since I got into the system, each time it's been an improvement. The Infinity platform on the IQ4 has by far been the largest leap,
Biggest jump, yeah,
in terms of quality and user experience. So what I can do with the IQ4 now has really changed the way that I work.
Wow. Okay. Well, looking forward to seeing some shots and seeing that in more detail. I guess one of the reasons I wanted you to shoot with the XT as well that we'll look at is because you'll have great insight because of your use of Cambo, and of course the IQ4 can still be used on your Cambo system and it works beautifully and you produce lovely images. But some of that extra functionality that's in the XT system using the IQ4 to power it is really, I guess, the next level or the next thing that has kind of moved the field camera or technical camera on a little bit. So yeah, we'll talk more about that as we go into the shots. But why don't we bring up the first image? And
the first image that I took with my IQ4. So this wasn't actually photographed on the XT. It was photographed on my Cambo, but optically it's the same optics.
Lenses.
It's the same lenses, and it's the same back. It's that Phase 1 bit in the middle that is different.
the shutter and the body are the other things that are different.
So this is actually using an electronic shutter, and believe it or not, I was doing a workshop in Sydney for a camera store up there for format high-tech filters, and it was a long exposure workshop. So we've done this workshop, we've gone out with a group, and I've spent the whole day with them showing them the benefits of using neutral density filters to reduce your exposure. Sure. So I let all my filters out and I thought I'm going to try the exposure averaging, which we haven't mentioned as yet, but it is a new function of the IQ4 platform. That's right. And essentially what it is, it enables you to do long exposures like this shot that I have up on the screen at the moment without the use of any filters at all. So this exposure is a 15-minute exposure. Effectively what the camera's done, it's taken 700 exposures at 0.6 of a second and blended them all together.
And that comes back to that processing power that we were referencing earlier with the IQ4. It's only because there's so much grunt inside that back that it can take the data from 700 odd 16-bit 150 megapixel files and blend those together, average them, of course, because that's what it's called, frame averaging, to be able to provide you the same kind of effect you'd get on an image as you would with using a 10-stop ND filter or something like that. But there are further benefits to the frame averaging tool as well, which I'm sure we'll get into. But
absolutely. Yeah. So this was the first shot that I did, and I'd been discussing this new feature with another Phase 1 shooter, and the feature basically has 2 modes, and when you get down to under a certain time frame in terms of shutter speed, it goes into what's called continuous mode.
That's right.
And we both had developed this theory that in continuous mode you would only get really smooth, silky, long exposures. And I've got to say that using the XT for the last couple of weeks, having a play with that, I've now come to the realisation that I don't need to be using filters at all, that I can get away with it because there really isn't much difference.
That's right. Well, we'll touch on that quickly. So the difference between continuous and gap, I think they call it gap and gapless. Essentially, the difference between it is that it takes a certain amount of time for the sensor to read out the data for one image, and at a given shutter speed that might be slower than that time, that can be continuously happening, which is what the continuous or gapless readout is. When the shutter speed is faster, of course, that means that there will be a slight gap between the readouts happening, the data happening off the sensor. Absolutely. And that's where you've been employing a variable ND filter to dial your exposure back down so that you can get a longer exposure, or a longer shutter speed, I should say, allowing you to get that gapless effect. But now, as you've said, you've found that it's not necessarily required.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually blown away. So The whole point is when you're out in the field doing this sort of work, the last thing you want to be doing is lugging truckloads of gear with you.
right.
And my wife hates it when we travel because I have a huge suitcase full of camera gear and then a little carry-on case with my clothes. And if we go to Europe, I might only pull that out, 3 or 4 times on the trip, because what essentially will happen is while she's sleeping, I get up really early and go and I'll do a shot, and then I pack the gear away and carry my little Fuji for the rest of the day for my snapshots. But I don't like carrying all this gear, but it's been a necessity. So I've had a case just purely for filters, for ND filters, to control that exposure. So I think it's important to point out that we can only do this because of the electronic shutter.
That's right.
So it's reading the data off the sensor 1 row of pixels at a time. So continuous just means it's continually reading out. With a gap, it's reading out, and there will be a gap between one readout and the next. And my reasoning, whether it be right or wrong, was that if there's a gap, there's going to be part of there that's not averaging out properly. But
As you found.
I've proven that not to be an issue. Yeah, because we're in lockdown at the moment.
We were when you shot these, especially, weren't we?
So a lot of these are just very, very close to my house and locations that I've shot before. On the left of the screen as you are looking now, this is Brighton Baths in Brighton, Victoria, Port Phillip Bay. So we have an exposure of 4 minutes, and it's an average of 551 frames.
Now, I'm just going to stop you there. When you say an exposure, what you mean is that the total time that the camera was active for, more so than the exposure.
You're absolutely correct. In actual fact, the exposure is only 1/25th of a second.
That's right. Yeah.
But I've been making 1/25th of a second exposures for 4 minutes and blending them all together into one raw file. And this is really important to understand too. I'm blending them into a raw file.
Raw file.
I tried to explain this to someone who said, oh yeah, my camera does that too. I've got an Olympus and it can do that. And I said, no, it can't. And he goes, yeah, it does that. I said, yeah, but it'll process it to a JPEG.
That's right.
So you've lost all the ability to edit the file. But the difference with this, with the averaging, is when we expose for a really long time, our sensor gets hot. So we get a lot of noise. Because it's averaging, what it's doing, it's actually averaging out the noise, because the noise is moving around from frame to frame. So we get images that are silky smooth and really, really clean.
That's exactly right.
And I've been criticised. Oh, they're too clean. We like grain, we like this, that, and the other, and that's a subjective thing. But landscape photographers have traditionally shot on 5x4 and 10:8 to get rid of the grain, to get that absolute detail there. So if you're into that sort of photography, you cannot beat this system.
And I suppose if grain is your thing, or if you think a particular image could do with some grain, there's no reason you can't add that in afterwards. But at least it's not baked into the file and you're having to actually deal with it as a problem, as opposed to using it as a creative element in the final image you might bring up.
That's right. And the grain tool in Capture One is fantastic if that's what you want to do. Yeah. And then there's a heap of film styles that emulate films that you may have used in the past, and you can add that back in. It's much easier to add it later than to take it out when you don't want it.
Yeah, better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
Exactly. So these shots are obviously different. It was a very, very windy day, but I took 2 shots, one after the other, just to see the difference between a gapless and a continuous shot. So with the live view on the IQ4, it's better than any live view on any phase back that I've had before it, and it gives me a very, very good simulation of my exposure.
That's right.
So still thinking in this term that I have to make it gapless, I purchased a high quality variable ND, which I placed onto the lens. I got it into live view and I set it to the exposure that I wanted to make it gapless, which is about half a second. Right. And then I would dial it down to get my histogram right.
Yes.
So shooting to the
You
right.
would control your exposure in that way.
So I was controlling, so I'm looking through the live view, dialing down my variable ND to the point where my histogram's looking good, and then taking the shot. So here's 2 shots that I shot. The first one has gaps between the frames, is not continuous, and I've shot that at 1/25th of a second on f11. It's on a 70mm Digiron W Rodenstock lens. So both shots are exactly the same. The only difference between the shot on the left to the shot on the right is the exposure time. They're both averaged out at 4 minutes, but the one on the right, I've put my variable ND on and dialed it down to bring my exposure down to half a second to make the exposure continuous. Right. So it's continually exposing one after the other as opposed to having gaps. Almost no difference.
Very little difference.
There is, what I'm finding is I'm getting a really nice texture in my Cs where I'm getting almost like a painterly effect
It does look like that, doesn't it?
that I'm really enjoying. It is there in both frames. It just tends to be cleaner when I'm not using the filter.
Yeah, which makes sense as well because, I mean, aside from the gapless to gap debate, anytime you're putting an extra piece of glass, no matter how high quality it is, in front of the elements in the lens and of course in front of the sensor, it's going to have an effect on how the image looks.
Absolutely. Look, it introduces other problems like lens flare and so forth as well, because it's putting a glass element further forward than the element of the lens. The biggest thing that stuck out to me was, even though it's a really, really high quality filter, the nature in which a variable ND works is essentially two polarizers. So I was getting a colour shift. And I found that colour shift, when we look at colour images, to be really displeasing. And when I looked at the image straight out of the camera, I could see no perceived benefit by putting the filter on, but I could see a real degradation of the colour by putting the filter on. So for me now, after having this, I only went out with the camera 4, maybe 5 times to try it out, but that was enough to convince me that I no longer need that filter.
Great.
Yeah, I really don't need the filter. So, and then I did the same experiment again. Incidentally, I'll just show you one where it is a single frame at half a second.
Yeah. Okay. So it takes I mean, it's still a beautifully well exposed, beautifully well composed image, but it probably looks a little more like a generic photo, if I could say that, than the others. And I guess that shows one of the creative benefits of the frame averaging tool. It can take something that would otherwise, as I said, be a very nice, technically a nice image, but perhaps not as interesting or not as eye-catching as an image that's got that long exposure element to it, going for that creative look.
Absolutely. And look, and I've always made a point of taking a single frame without the filter, just to check that my exposure is correct.
Sure.
Okay. Now that we have this exposure simulation mode on the back,
another benefit of IQ4.
which is another benefit of the IQ4, I don't have to do it, but I still do it because sometimes I actually prefer the short exposure.
Yeah.
So shooting long exposure is something that I really like to do because I like the effects that I get, but I do like short exposure captured images as well, and then I've got the choice of both. What I find funny is I had someone criticise my work once, saying that why long exposure? Why not just wait for the clouds to look good and take it like that? And look, and then I suppose that's subjective, and there is some truth to that. Their comment was, it's so easy just to go out and blur it all out and make it look good.
I don't know about that.
And I have to disagree with that. It's the exact opposite. When it's a cloudy day, perhaps yes, all right? On a sunny day, when you've got 1 or 2 clouds, you really have no idea what you're going to end up with. Right. And sometimes I'm really pleasantly surprised, and sometimes I'm really disappointed and go home thinking I'm going to have to come back and do that again. That's the nature of the technique. Right. But I really enjoy it, and the IQ platform has now made it easy from a user experience to achieve these results. I can't go back. It's more than the size of the sensor. Okay, so medium format definitely has a better look to it. Some people claim not to be able to see it. I would debate that. It's there. The files are so clean. The colour rendition. It's a true 16-bit file. So it's. Unfortunately, people look in Photoshop and think that their digital SLR is giving them a 16-bit file. It's not. Photoshop will call everything above 8-bit 16-bit. Sure. They should really call it high-bit. Sure. The IQ4 is capturing in true 16-bit.
That's right. Yeah.
So we're getting a full 15 stops of dynamic range. That's right. And that's giving me the ability to, if you have a look at the right-hand side of the frame here, where we've got basically sunlight reflected on the water at about 7 o'clock in the morning, and it's held it beautifully. But the tonality throughout the frame, the subtle tones, I can't get that. I run Canon cameras and Fuji cameras, and I can't. They give me great results, but I cannot get the subtlety and the colour fidelity that I get with my IQ4.
And of course, I mean, there is that old saying that a picture's not a picture until it's printed as well, and you're a very enthusiastic large format printer.
Absolutely. So I'm an Ilford master, and master printer rather, and a master. And I like to print all of my stuff. And when you see these prints, printed at 1.5 metres by 1.5 metres, and you can look right into them and see the scratches on the poles and so forth. It's mesmerising.
And that's probably, unfortunately, what we have here. You're still not going to appreciate those benefits until you see a print, and that's where it really does shine and come into its own.
Absolutely.
Let's talk a bit more about your time, I guess, with the XT in comparison to the Cambo system. That you're using a WRS 1600, aren't you?
So yeah, for all intents and purposes, the actual cameras are very, very similar. Right. They have a lever where I can go from portrait to landscape without having to remove the back. Right. They're very, very similar. The way the lens, it's the same lens mount, it's the same optics, it's the same digital back. So we're really talking about that piece of metal between the lens and the back.
You wouldn't think it would have such a big effect or a big difference, really, would you?
But I think so. Phase One have been very smart. So rather than reinvent the camera, they've gone to a company that manufactures really, really good cameras and introduce their design element. That's right. So they've looked at it and said, well, we think this would work better for us. Yeah. So just little things like the portrait to landscape. Right. Okay, mine is square. It's in portrait. It's in landscape. It's actually round on the XT, so you can stop it anywhere. Yeah. To be perfectly honest with you, when I was first shown the XT, I thought this is beautiful. All right, this is a really, really good setup. However, there's not enough in it to make me to consider changing from my Cambo to the XT. Having it for 2 weeks, however, has made me reevaluate that as well. So for me, the biggest difference is the user experience.
Yes, okay. And that's what's been unlocked, I guess, with the XT, given that the clever people at Phase One have put some electronic contacts onto that camera, both at the front and the back of it, which means that both the lens, the X shutter that they've also developed, which we haven't talked about yet, but that's another great improvement that's taken things forward from the Cambo and Alpa and traditional technical camera systems with their Copal shutters, now using the electromagnetic X shutter and the communication that can provide. Passing that through the Cambo manufactured but Phase One designed XT body into the IQ4. It's a two-way conversation as well. So the IQ4 is, of course, controlling the shutter speed and other various things that the lens is doing and the shutter's doing, as well as, and we'll show this, the movements of the digital back, so the rise and fall and the horizontal shift. That's all recorded in the file. It shows up on the back of the camera when you're getting ready to take your shot and compose. Those are the things that have brought, I think, the technical camera into the modern day much more that were really required, I think, and hopefully, as you said, have made the user experience all that more rewarding.
Absolutely. Look, I suppose at the end of the day, you don't miss what you don't have. But once you've had it, then you miss it. So if you've been shooting with a digital SLR or with an XF camera, there's metadata in the file. And that's because the lens is communicating with the back and everything's talking to each other. So when you bring your file into Capture One or into your raw processing software, if you're not using Phase One, whatever you're using, the software knows what lens was used and can apply certain profiles to get the best out of those optics. That process is somewhat complicated when we start shifting the lens. All right, so if you are using like a Canon, I have a Canon 5 DSR with a tilt shift lens, I don't get any metadata to tell me what the shift is. So with the XT and the electronic communication between the lens and the back, Phase One have been able to introduce this. So if I was shooting with my Cambo WRS and I had a shift movement, I would have to record that manually.
Or remember it.
Yeah. I would also have to remember what lens, because it won't tell me in the metadata what lens I've used, because it's essentially a dumb camera. It's a metal plate that holds the lens and it holds the back. That's right. Optically beautifully, engineered beautifully, but in terms of metadata, it's dumb. That's right. The XT records everything. It records the movement of the camera. It records what lens I'm in. So when I bring it into Capture One, it automatically knows what profile to apply. So not only is it applying a profile for the optics, it's then also applying a profile for the amount of shift that I've moved, because with the big image circle of these lenses, the profile is going to be different depending on where the sensor is positioned within that image circle in relation to it. And by measuring the shift movement electronically and recording it within the metadata, Capture One's able to make those corrections without me having to do anything. At the start, I don't have to think about it.
Great. So I guess that built-in metadata has hopefully just improved the user experience even more.
It's just another step that makes the capture process much easier.
Great, great. Well, why don't we move on to another image now, and you can tell us a bit about this. It's probably one of my favourites from this set.
Something quite interesting happened on that day because it is a much easier camera to use than my Cambo.
Sure.
So I went down. This is Cardinia Reservoir, and I've always been fascinated with this structure. And if you know my work, you know that I'm not a landscape photographer in the truest sense of the word. I actually like to photograph man's interaction with the landscape. So I like structures and buildings within the landscape. Yeah. And this has always fascinated me. And I like that Stanley Kubrick, one-point perspective, looking straight on. Yeah. So I went down, walked out onto the dam wall, set the camera up. I actually used a filter on this because this was the first time that I used it before I decided I didn't need to use filters anymore. Yeah. So it's a 1 second exposure for 7 continuous minutes, made up of 420 1 second shutter speed shots, blended together to give us the long exposure effect or the averaged effect, average out effect. It was a miserable day, but I love the way that exposure averaging averages out a lot of the noise. So I'm able to pull more detail out of my highlights than I possibly could in the past. So I could get detail out of the sky. It's very subtle detail. If you have a look here in the sky.
Yeah,
very,
but
very subtle cloud detail.
You wouldn't necessarily see that.
I couldn't see it on the day when I was looking there because it was just white. There's been no noise reduction filters applied in post or anything like that. That's pretty much straight out of the camera. I've gone into the highlight tool and reclaimed my highlights. And it's fantastic.
I can't wait to see that one printed.
Part of the user experience with the new XT camera is Phase 1 have developed this new electromagnetic shutter.
The X shutter.
The X shutter. And it probably doesn't sound like much, but anyone that's used a large format camera in the past will notice it's quite a lengthy process. There's quite a number of steps to take an exposure with the shutter in the lens, which is generally Copal shutters. Mechanical shutters, spring-loaded. So we have to open the lens to focus, close the lens, cock the shutter, set the aperture, set the shutter speed, take the shot. Then if we're doing a long exposure, there's the black calibration. Okay, so we have to have our shutter exposed to that. That's another interesting point that I should touch on. If I'm doing a 7-minute exposure with a filter, I will then have a 7-minute black calibration file, all right, which is going to clean all the noise out. But with a 7-minute frame average shot that has a 1 second exposure, my black calibration exposure is only 1 second. So my time to go and shoot again is so much quicker. That's a real advantage out in the field. Isn't it? Absolutely.
I've had that conversation with people before where they've said, oh, great, I can take a 1 hour exposure. And you have to remind them at that point,
2 hours.
It's actually going to be a 2 hour process because it's got a equal length black calibration, but that's less of a factor with the frame average.
And it gets even worse because if you're out in the freezing cold and you think, well, I'll let that camera do the black calibration, jump back in the car, forget it, because you need to be in the same conditions.
That's right. It needs to be temperature-wise, it needs to be the same relative condition to the exposure, otherwise the black calibration will be thrown out.
Absolutely. So that's gone. So that's a really, really good thing. But we sort of digressed a little bit. What I was getting at was I packed everything up except the camera, because what I do is I use a little app on my phone rather than lugging all my lenses out to where I want to go. I use a viewfinder app and I determine what I'm going to shoot first and then only bring the gear I need. So I walked out on this dam wall with a tripod under one arm, a camera under the other. But as I was walking back, what I love about this X shutter, it's essentially like a digital SLR in the sense you push the shutter button, the minute it's taken the shot and displayed it on the screen, you're ready to go again. You can even put it in continuous mode. Yeah. So it's just push, push, push. So I thought that really opens up new prospects for using this sort of camera handheld. I had a play with it, and there's a shot that I took handheld.
You were just walking back to the car.
And I thought I'll just take this shot. So this is just a single exposure. It was taken at 200th of a second. I did boost up the ISO to give me a reasonably fast shutter speed, but I just wouldn't have even bothered with my Cambo because the process is this is essentially a medium format mirrorless camera.
In some way, I mean, it literally doesn't have a mirror in it, but you wouldn't call it necessarily a mirrorless camera.
Well, it is.
The way you can use it
is like a mirrorless camera. You use the live view and bang and shoot. Exactly. So that opens up a whole lot of opportunities, and I see that being really advantageous to a lot of guys that are out there shooting aerial at the moment. You know, they're taping their lenses onto infinity, that and the other. aside from the optics are so much better from these Rodenstock lenses, would be a really good aerial camera. You can hold it and push the button, and it's just going to do it all for you. And you're ready to go again. So.
Yeah, well, I haven't seen too many people taking aerial imagery yet with them, but I'm sure it will spark some people's interest and intrigue.
So that was a real bonus for me. I hadn't expected to be able to do that.
And hold, yeah. And again, I think Phase One really kept that in their mind in the design process, trying to keep the form factor as compact as they could, and I think that shutter button is something we take for granted so much with other cameras. Of course, it's our main interface with the camera, but as you've said, on a large format or a technical camera in the past, you might have an old school plunger style cable release, but just having that shutter button instantly opens you up to, oh, hang on a minute, I could just point the camera there and okay, cool, I'm focused, I'm good, okay, done.
I think it plays with Phase One's philosophy. So when they developed the XF camera, they remained true to keeping their digital backs as part of a system, so they could be used elsewhere. Yeah. But then they created a lot of those processes fall down because once you have a camera that is part of a system, you lose that integration.
That's right.
All right. So Phase One developed the XF camera, so we have a fully integrated back and camera. That could be totally fused together for all intents and purposes, like a digital SLR. We haven't had that with a technical camera. Until now. Now we have a fully integrated technical camera, so that completes the circle.
It does, yeah. Nice way of putting it. Well, I guess one of the other things we wanted to touch on, which is at this point is still a beta tool. It's not, I guess, officially supported in full from Phase One yet, but it's part of what they call Phase One Lab, which is a early access tool for photographers. If they're interested, they can enable it. And at the moment, that tool is Dual Exposure Plus, but during firmware upgrades in the future, there might be something else that they bring out into the Phase One Lab part of the digital back, which will mean you can play and try different things and see what they're getting at and give feedback as well, which is the other cool thing. And you've used it here, and I want you to sort of talk us through what it is and why you might use it and your impressions of it.
Okay, so Dual Exposure Plus. Essentially, it is still in beta format and part of the lab system, but that's a great thing with current technology is that they can introduce things like this with a firmware update.
That's right.
So they can make the lenses focus better. They can offer new features and
try things.
So exposure averaging was a firmware update.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're getting all this extra value and not having to part with any extra cash, which is great. So the current one, what happens is with the data distribution in a file, the least amount of data is in the shadow areas.
That's right.
So if you're underexposing your shadow areas, when you try and pull those shadows out, because there's not enough data there, you get a lot of noise. It replaces it with noise.
Not a lot of signal and a lot of noise.
Not a lot of signal, you get a lot of noise. Right. So what happens is you take two exposures, one for the shadows, one for the highlights, and you blend them together. Phase One, and I've got to say the one on the left here, rather, in single exposure mode, is without Dual Exposure Plus. And because Phase One camera has 15 stops of dynamic range, it is actually pretty good. It's St Kilda Pier in Victoria. Yeah. It's a single frame. I'm shooting directly into the sun. The sun is actually in the frame above the little awning out the side of the cafe here. So I'm actually shooting directly into the sun. The sun is shielded by the awning, but I am shooting directly into the sun. I've exposed for the sky. So if you look at the shot that I've actually taken.
Exposing to the right.
So it's one frame. And all I've done here is I've done a white balance, a slight exposure adjustment to get the sky where I want it, and then I've used my shadow recovery tool to pull out the shadows. It's pretty mind-blowing. If I go in here, okay, so there's the before and the after, okay? Yeah. It is actually quite good. But what we will notice if we're going to get really picky, and you said that I'm quite pedantic, and in a white pane there is definitely noise there. Yeah, it's not unattractive, but what happens with noise is we lose contrast. We can get a bit of a colour shift because of the noise in the file. With Dual Exposure Plus, it is essentially still one exposure in terms of the user experience from the photographer.
That's right.
You set your shutter speed, you expose for your highlights, expose to the right.
ETTR.
All right, in ETTR, or in this case on an XT, I'm just using the histogram on the back of the camera, but we're exposing to the right, which is what we have all been taught to do.
That's right.
Get our data up the right end of the frame. let your shadows fall where they fall. Now, essentially, the shadows are going to be really, really dark. What Dual Exposure Plus does, it is not a HDR program. It's not a HDR facility. What it does is it takes the exposure as you've set the camera.
That's right.
So where your highlights are, where your shadows are. But what it does uniquely to a single capture that doesn't have that enabled, it takes a second frame almost simultaneously. So immediately after, it takes another frame 3 stops brighter. So what it's doing is it's capturing the shadow data 3 stops brighter than the highlight than what it does in a regular frame. So when we go into Capture One and we go into our highlight and shadow recovery tool and we recover those shadows, when it's recovering the shadows, what it does is it references that second exposure where the shadows are exposed 3 stops brighter. 3 stops brighter means way less noise, okay? So what it's effectively doing is extending what already is a huge dynamic range of 15 stops out to about 18 stops.
That's right, yeah.
So it means that you can now really recover shadow detail. Not sure if you're going to be able to pick that up on your screen, but if we look in the dark areas here and in this red strip in the middle, the one with Dual Exposure Plus enabled is certainly much, much cleaner. But that's a real advantage, particularly if you're doing interiors or doing real estate. And these features that we're talking about here work fantastically on the XT, but they also work on the XF. So if you've got an XF Phase 1 and an IQ4 back, these facilities are there for you as well, or these tools are there to use as well. We just happen to have done this on the XT.
That's right.
So this is something that's built into the back.
Isn't it great? So I guess feedback from you now that you've got your head around what it's for and why you use it, it's a thumbs up?
Oh, absolutely. Now that I understand it. So although I'm pedantic, I'm not a reader. I'm a photographer. I like to look at pictures. So when there's a really long written explanation on what it does, I gloss over it. Sure. And that's probably the danger, is I gloss over it. I never really understood what it was doing. I watched that webinar with Drew and Lau the other day, and all of a sudden the penny dropped. I went out the next day and did this, and am blown away. And there are plenty of situations in my commercial career where this is going to be really, really applicable. Sure. My personal work, I tend to choose the time of day that's best suited for me.
You don't always have that luxury though when you're shooting a commercial job.
This is a real tool. So some people will go out and take 5 frames and blend them together later to try and do it. I can do it in 1 exposure, and I have all of that range to play with.
Wonderful.
It's fantastic.
Well, I guess that probably brings us to the end of it, doesn't it? There's nothing else I wanted to ask you, really. I've been really impressed with what you've done, and I knew that you'd spit out some beautiful images, even with some of the restrictions we had in place around what you could do and where you could go. But I hope you really enjoyed using the XT, and of course you know the IQ4 so well already. And
absolutely. No, it's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been a really good learning curve for me too. I've picked up that I'm no longer going to be using my filters. I don't need to. That's a real bonus for me. But I've really changed my opinion. Where when it first came out, I thought there's not enough in it to warrant me changing. I'm really having a rethink about that, because all those extra features of that total integration just make for a much cleaner, more enjoyable user workflow.
That's right. And you know, we've got further lenses on the way as well. Phase 1 have said that the 50mm lens now from Rodenstock is available for ordering, and there are more coming as well. So it's only going to continue to get more comprehensive and better. And I can't wait to see you shoot with it again soon.
I look forward to it.
Great. Well, thanks very much for joining us today. Hope you really enjoyed that, and we look forward to chatting more with you if you're interested. We'll put some links in the comments where you can get in touch with us to maybe get a bit more of a run through in detail on the XT camera or the IQ4 or anything else to do with Phase 1. And until next time, stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.